Okay, so you're ready to dive into English in 2025. That's awesome. But let's face it, it's a lot out there, right? I mean, AI tutors, apps. Everyone's promising you'll be fluent like that. Even this podcast we're looking at today, they're talking about how easy it is to just get totally lost, like overwhelmed with all the choices.
Yeah, for sure. It can feel like you're drowning in options. But the
Okay.
good news is you don't need every single new tool and trick. We're going to break it all down for you so you can build a routine that actually works long term.
And speaking of routines, remember that comparison to working out? Well, the podcast actually mentions a study. Learners who studied consistently, like even just a little bit every day, they actually did better than those who crammed a ton, but only every once in a while. It's all about building that habit.
I love that because let's be real, life gets in the way.
Yeah.
So
Oh.
to hear that I don't have to block off hours every day,
Yeah.
that's a huge relief.
Yeah.
But why is routine so important? What's the big deal? Well, think about it this way. Having a routine gets your brain ready to learn. When you're hearing and seeing English all the time, your brain picks up on patterns like grammar and how words sound, almost without you realizing it. Repetition is super key here.
So even if I'm not catching every single word at first, just hearing the sounds is helpful.
Absolutely, and especially now in 2025. There's so much cool tech to help us immerse ourselves, like those AI-powered apps. The podcast guests were raving about Duolingo and Memrise. They adjust to your level as you go.
Yeah, I've tried those out a bit, but one thing I'm always struggling with is my pronunciation. I feel like I'm
Yeah.
stuck.
That's where these real-time feedback tools come in. The podcast specifically mentioned ELSA Speak. It actually analyzes how you're saying things and gives you instant tips. They even had a linguist on who explained how that kind of micro-feedback can help you retrain the muscles you use to speak to get those tricky English sounds right.
Wow, that's so much more precise than just repeating phrases from a textbook. But how do I fit all of this into my actual life? The podcast talks about watching shows with subtitles, listening to music. It's a lot.
It's not about adding a whole bunch of extra stuff to your to-do list. It's about making English a natural part of what you're already doing. Like imagine, you're commuting to work, pop on a true crime podcast, but in English this time. Or while you're making dinner, you're quizzing yourself with an app. The podcast guests actually challenge listeners to find ways to Englishify their hobbies.
Now that is brilliant. It's like tricking yourself into learning. But if I want to create a routine that really sticks, I need some structure. The podcast mentions this input, practice, output framework.
Yeah, that's a great one. It's a really simple way to make sure you're covering all your bases. So input, that's all about surrounding yourself with the language, podcasts, books, even using AI tutors. The key here is to pick things you actually enjoy.
Okay. So if I'm obsessed with cooking shows, I should be watching those in English, even if I only understand half of what they're saying at first.
Exactly. It helps you get used to how English flows, the rhythm, the sounds. Now practice. That's where you're actively working on your skills, like building your vocabulary, doing grammar exercises, and working on your pronunciation. Apps like Duolingo or Memrise can be really helpful for that.
Makes sense. But what about having real conversations? Apps can only take you so far. The podcast talks about finding a language partner.
Right. They really emphasize how important it is to interact with real people. They actually cited this study where learners who practice with a partner, they progress twice as fast compared to those who only studied on their own. So they suggest finding someone who's also learning, or even a native speaker. There are tons of online communities for that.
Oh, wow. That's great to know, but also a little intimidating. What if I mess up?
Well, that's where 2025 has a huge advantage. AI chatbots. The podcast guests were all about ChatGPT and how it can simulate real conversations so you can practice all kinds of scenarios without feeling self-conscious.
Okay, that does sound a lot less scary, especially at the beginning. But what about actually using English out in the world? That's the output stage, right?
You got it. That's where you take everything you've learned and put it into practice, like ordering food in English or joining an online discussion forum.
So even if I just leave a comment on a YouTube video in English, that counts.
Absolutely. Every little bit helps. The podcast even suggested using ChatGPT to practice writing emails or social media posts in English. The important thing is to actively use the language, not just listen or read.
I'm loving this framework. It actually feels doable. But let's be real for a sec. Finding the time to do all of this, that's a challenge. The podcast mentions fitting English into your daily life, but do they have any specific advice on that?
They do. They actually break it down how even 30 minutes a day can be really effective if you're strategic about it. Like
Yeah.
you could do 10 minutes of vocab, 20 minutes listening to a podcast, and then another 10 practicing speaking with ChatGPT. It's about finding those little pockets of time and using them wisely.
Wow. That is such a relief. I always thought I needed hours and hours to make any real progress. But what about those days when even finding 30 minutes feels impossible?
The podcast talked about that too. They said to focus on quality over quantity. So even 5 minutes of really focused vocab review is better than nothing. They even suggested keeping flashcards with you so you can squeeze in a quick review while you're waiting in line or on your commute.
I love that. Little hacks like that can make a big difference. It's amazing how much you can learn if you use those in-between moments. But okay, real talk. Staying motivated is usually the hardest part for me. I start out all gung-ho, and then my energy just fizzles out. What did the podcast guests say about staying on track?
They had some really great tips first. They talked about setting micro goals. So instead of this huge, overwhelming goal like fluency, break it down into smaller, more manageable steps, like aiming to learn 10 new words each week or finishing a chapter of a book in English.
That makes so much sense. It's like those fitness challenges where you start with just a few minutes of exercise and then gradually increase it. Small wins help you build momentum, right?
Exactly. And they also suggest rewarding yourself. When you hit those milestones, watch an episode of your favorite show in English or treat yourself to something you enjoy. It's about making the process fun and rewarding, not just another chore.
I love that. It's not about being super strict with yourself. It's about celebrating those little wins. That changes everything. But what about those days when I just hit a wall and feel like giving up? The podcast mentioned something about tracking your progress as a way to stay motivated.
Yes, it's so easy to get discouraged when it feels like you're not making any progress. But if you actually track what you're learning, whether it's in a notebook, a spreadsheet, or an app, you can see how far you've come.
Oh, I get it. So I can look back and be like, wow, I learned 500 new words this month. That's way more motivating than focusing on what I don't know yet.
Exactly. It helps you shift your perspective from what you're lacking to what you've achieved. They also talked about the power of having an accountability buddy, someone to share your goals with, who can cheer you on and keep you motivated when you're struggling.
That's a really good point. I've seen that work for fitness challenges, so it makes sense for language learning too. But how do you find someone like that? Especially if none of my friends are learning English.
They suggest looking online. There are so many platforms and communities for language exchange. You can connect with learners from all over the world, and you can even find people who share your interests.
Oh, that's so cool. Imagine practicing English while talking about your favorite books or movies. It's like combining learning and socializing. The podcast also mentioned something about making learning fun.
Oh yeah, they had a whole section on that. They called it gamifying the process. They suggested things like word games, TikTok challenges, even making up silly dialogues in English while you're doing chores.
That sounds hilarious. I can totally see myself having full-blown conversations with my plants in English. But seriously, if it's fun, it takes the pressure off. And you actually want to practice more.
For sure. They even talked about incorporating English into your hobbies. Like, if you love to cook, watch cooking shows in English, or try following recipes in English.
Okay, that is genius. It's like sneaking in extra study time without even realizing it. It all comes back to finding what you enjoy and making it a part of your life.
Exactly. But they also had some advice for people who have very, very limited time. They suggested focusing on one specific skill at a time. So like, if you're really struggling with pronunciation, dedicate 10 minutes every day to practicing with the LSA Speak.
So it's about prioritizing and making the most of those few minutes you have.
Right. They actually shared a study that found that short bursts of focused study were more effective for remembering things than longer sessions where you're distracted.
That's good to know. It means I can still make progress, even if I only have 10 minutes here and there. But how do you stay motivated when it feels like it's going to take forever to reach your goal?
The podcast emphasizes the importance of reminding yourself why you're learning English. What are your goals? What doors will it open for you? Visualize yourself using English confidently in those situations.
Okay, so if I'm dreaming of traveling to Japan someday, I should picture myself ordering food at a restaurant or chatting with locals, all in English, like I'm actually there.
Exactly. And that mental image can be a powerful motivator, especially on those days when you're feeling discouraged. It reminds you that every little step you take is bringing you closer to that goal.
This is such a refreshing way to think about language learning. It's not just about textbooks and grammar rules. It's about finding what works for you, making it fun, and remembering all the amazing possibilities that await.
You got it. And remember, you're not alone on this journey. There's a whole community of learners out there going through the same challenges. and celebrating the same victories. Don't be afraid to reach out, connect with others, and share your experiences.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I feel so inspired to revamp my own English learning routine. But before we wrap up, there was one final point in the podcast that really stuck with me.
Oh, what was that?
It was that idea of micro-actions. They talked about how even tiny things, like just spending 5 minutes reviewing vocab, can actually add up to a big difference over time.
Right, it's like compound interest. Small efforts building on each other, leading to big results. They told this great story about a woman who learned one new English word every day while she was brushing her teeth. 2 years later, she had a vocab of over 700 words.
That's amazing. You don't need these big grand gestures, just consistent little actions. So if you had to give our listeners just one piece of advice based on all this wisdom, what would it be?
Don't get hung up on finding the perfect method or the best app. Just start today, even if it's 5 minutes listening to a song in English or writing one sentence. Action creates motivation, and that's what'll keep you going.
I love that. It's about taking that first step and building from there. And you know what? As we've been talking, I keep thinking about how important mindset is in this whole language learning thing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The podcast guests actually talked about that too. The importance of seeing mistakes as opportunities to learn. They even mentioned some research that showed learners who embraced their mistakes and used them as feedback, they actually progressed faster.
That takes so much pressure off. You don't have to be perfect all the time. It reminds me of something else they talked about, celebrating your progress.
Yes, they really emphasize that. No matter how small the win feels, acknowledge it. Maybe you finally understand a grammar concept, or you had a short conversation in English, or you watched a whole movie without subtitles.
It's like you're training your brain to focus on the positive and build that feeling of accomplishment, which then makes you want to keep going.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to remember that learning English opens up a whole world of possibilities. It's not just about mastering a language, it's about connecting with people and cultures and ideas from all over the planet.
It's like you're gaining a superpower, the ability to communicate with millions of new people, to experience different cultures, and access information and entertainment from around the world.
And those connections, they can enrich your life in so many ways, from personal relationships to professional opportunities.
So to anyone listening who's feeling a little intimidated or unsure where to start, remember this: you are capable of achieving your language learning goals. And with the right approach, it can be a fun and exciting adventure. Start small, stay consistent, find what brings you joy, and never underestimate the power of those small actions.
Well said. We're all cheering you on.
Until next time, happy learning. It was that idea of micro-actions, like they were saying. Even tiny things, like spending 5 minutes going over vocab, can make a big difference over time.
It's like compound interest, huh? All those little efforts add up and lead to some serious growth. They had this great anecdote in the podcast about this woman. She learned one new English word every single day while brushing her teeth, just a couple minutes. And after 2 years, she had a vocab of over 700 words.
That's wild. You don't need these big dramatic changes, just those small, consistent actions. So if you could give our listeners one piece of advice from everything we've talked about today, what would it be?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think I'd say, don't get caught up in trying to find the absolute perfect method or the best app out there. Just start today, even if it's just for a few minutes. Listen to an English song, write a sentence, anything. Taking action creates motivation, and that's what's going to keep you going.
I love that. It's about taking that first step and then building from there. And as we've been talking, I keep coming back to how important your mindset is for all of this.
Yeah, totally. The podcast actually talked about that too.
Yeah.
About how important it is to see mistakes as opportunities to learn. They even talked about this research study that showed that learners who were okay with making mistakes and used them as feedback, they actually ended up learning faster.
I think that's so key. It takes all that pressure off. You don't have to be perfect right away. Which reminds me of another thing they mentioned, celebrating your progress.
Oh, yeah. That's huge. They really emphasize that. No matter how small the win is, make sure you acknowledge it. Maybe you finally get a grammar concept, or you're able to have a little conversation in English, or you watch an entire movie without the subtitles.
Yeah, it's like you're training your brain. Focus on the positive. And that sense of accomplishment keeps you motivated.
Totally. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's important to remember that learning English opens up so many doors. It's not just about the language itself. It's about connecting with people from all over the world, different cultures, different ideas.
It really is like gaining a superpower to be able to communicate with millions of new people, experience different cultures, and get access to all this information and entertainment from around the world.
It's incredible. And those connections can really enrich your life in so many ways, like in your personal relationships
Yeah,
or your career.
absolutely. So for anyone listening who might be feeling a bit intimidated or not sure where to even begin, remember this: you can do it. You are capable of reaching your language learning goals. And with the right approach, it can actually be a really fun and rewarding journey. So start small, be consistent, find what you enjoy, and never underestimate what you can achieve, even with those small actions.
So well said. We're all rooting for you out there.
And that's it for this deep dive. Until next time. Happy learning.